Hello and welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable with your regular hosts, Andrew and Matthew. Today we're going to be discussing the latest episode of Unbelievable on creationism and old earth creationism, featuring His Most Holiness Ken Ham. So with us, with Andrew and myself today, we've got Keith, who we've just found out in the preamble chat is also an IT geek, so lots more PC Mac stuff to come, and he's actually in Andrew's vicinity as well, which was even more interesting. So welcome on board, Keith.
Thank you.
And I got in touch with you through the Everyone's Agnostic Facebook group, which I've been involved on for a couple of times with the glorious Dave Warnock, who's on there, who we had on a couple of episodes ago. Hello to anyone who might be listening from there. And I'd also like to give a good shout out to Dave from the Graceful Atheist. He had a guest on in his latest episode who mentioned Everyone's Agnostic and the Facebook group that you and I, Keith, are both a part of. And he also mentioned this podcast as well. So thank you to Dave and for his guest, Fred. So, right. On to young earth creationism. All three of us are former young earth creationists. We feel that we have a right to and experience to talk about young earth creationism. We all have experience growing up in that, and we all ditched it for reasons that are going to come out later on. We have not shared any notes before this conversation. We have not had a strategy or a tactics conversation about this. So we've all listened to the episode in the last couple of days, but we don't know what each of us have taken from that episode.
It's hardly worthy of strategy.
Hardly
worthy of strategy.
So we're going to be winging it a bit here. I have got zero notes in front of me. I'm looking forward to hearing what Keith and Andrew have to say. I've got my own things that I want to say. I strongly suspect that we didn't need to listen to the episode because young earth creationism doesn't change much from outing to outing. But before we get into the teardown, I will say one thing in positivity to Ken Ham. He speaks well. I think that episode is the first time I've heard him speak at any length on young earth creationism. I've mostly just read his blog posts. So he speaks well. He's clearly experienced and well versed in what it is that he wants to say, and he's articulate in what it is that he wants to say. So I'll give him in that credit. And the other thing is, I agreed with quite a lot of things that he said on the episode, in the sense that I believe that young earth creationism is the purest and the simplest interpretation of the Bible. If you're going to take the Bible, take it all literally and go down young earth creationism, I absolutely accept that. And I also agree with Ken when he says that if you're going to introduce old earth or theistic evolution or anything that has the horrible word science connected to it, you undermine the authority of the Bible. I absolutely agree with that. And long may we be digging under the foundations of the Bible with science is my response to that. That this might be the last that I say something nice about His Highness the head of AIG, and this is going to be a no holds barred conversation. I've told the other two that don't self-censor, just go for it. If you feel like saying it, just say it as raw as you feel like it. So that's my first thing that I want to say about that episode. Over to you two.
Keith, go ahead. I'd love to hear. I think in the run-up in the emails, you mentioned that you were headed off to medical school or had some medical school training before becoming a software developer, and I'd love to hear your first hot wash over the episode.
Yeah. So briefly, I got my bachelor's degree in biology at Pensacola Christian College, which is a young earth creationist institution, and I went to grad school for biomedical research as a young earth creationist, ended up quitting in the middle of 2009 and the NIH funding crunch. My mentor wasn't able to keep the grant I was supported under, and moving to another lab was just looking like not a happening thing in that funding environment. So I took my hobby and turned it into a career, and I'm now a software engineer. Still very interested in biology and just the life sciences in general. My biggest takeaway from this interview that I listened to, which I just listened to it immediately before this, like I've been playing it all afternoon or all morning until, waiting up for the afternoon here. I have never actually heard Ken Ham debate another Christian of any stripe. And while a huge number of his arguments are extremely familiar to me, just, growing up listening to him, getting to hear his perspective on old earth creationism while addressing someone espousing that view instead of just being able to throw his one-liners out was really interesting. And I think that young earth creationism is exactly what those people who wrote the Bible were intending to communicate. And you really have to stretch to get to anything else. That said, I tend not to try jumping on religious folks who hold their holy texts a bit more loosely, because we all benefit the looser religious folk hold their founding documents. So I think Ken Ham's right, and I want more people to start sublimating those things that he's right about and viewing them as just sort of analogies and illustrations instead.
I think that's right. One of the things that I found interesting right up front is Ken Ham objected to being called a young Earth creationist. He complained that he's not a young Earth creationist. He's a biblical creationist, and he sort of founded that on predecessing comments about liberal interpretation of the Bible and being raised on the Word of God, and his dad being opposed to liberal interpretation and that sort of thing. And so I think it is fair to say that, at least in the vein of creation, the conservative view is to take the first 3 chapters of Genesis as literal history and not as some sort of allegory or some sort of figure of speech. And as a Bible student at a Christian college myself, and I'm guessing that PCC would have been the same way, the idea that the days in Genesis 1 were literal 24-hour periods was pretty uncontroversial, in conservative Christian circles.
Yeah. And if you look at Jewish scholarship on those books, because of course Christianity is just a massive retconning of Judaism anyway, and so they would know, they do interpret those as having originally been intended to be 24-hour days. Most observant Jews today are not young earth creationists, and over millennia they have chosen to sublimate certain things and to interpret some of these things while acknowledging the authors meant them a certain way, using them as allegories and examples for other things.
Yeah.
Did they really? It's interesting to hear you two talk about it, because my understanding was that those early writers didn't necessarily have the literal interpretation that modern day young earth creationists have, and that they wrote them down as stories, and they wrote them because they had no other way to describe the origins. So they thought, well, we kind of believe that there's a God, so let's kind of write down a story that kind of gives an idea of how God might have done it. And that story has grown over generations of retelling until it got written down in the Bible as we see it. And then now 1,000 years, 2,000 years later, there are people that believe it literally. That was kind of my take from the history of it, and that the literal, those people really did actually mean those 7 days when they wrote it down, kind of seeped in over time and wasn't necessarily there originally.
I think from what I understand, it's sort of a level of abstraction thing. The words themselves, they were telling a story that happened in 7 literal days, 6 literal days of creation, 1 literal day of rest. Whether or not that entire story was intended to be taken as a historical account is another thing. And where the modern old earth and young earth creationists get into this is saying, this is a historical story, how do we interpret it? The old earth creationists have to fight with the language of the story to make it any kind of historical account. The young earth creationists, in interpreting it as a historical account, have the plain meaning of the words available to them.
They do.
In the past, I think, yes, you're correct. Scholars tend to think that the story as a whole was not intended as a historical account, but the language of the story is a mythological account of a literal week.
And there are interpretation principles at risk here for the young earth creationist. So if we say that at some point in the past, those who penned these stories didn't actually mean them as a literal account of creation, the trouble is then that we have this thing in Scripture, this thing that's sort of codified, right? This Genesis account that's part of the canon, that isn't in some sense inspired in the verbal plenary sense of inspiration. And so whether the original penners of these stories intended them to be taken literally is almost not important, because you won't get serious young earth creationists to acknowledge that these stories are anything other than verbally transmitted from the Holy Spirit.
Absolutely. And they're having to ignore huge swaths of the context that they grew up in, such as those stories originated in literal polytheistic cultures. And so if they want to take the literal language too terribly far, I mean, they already have to use the Jewish monotheist interpretation of Elohim as sort of a poetic use of plural. But of course, originally when those stories were written, it was the Council of Gods that decided to create the world.
Right.
Yes, it is very interesting that there is that pluralization of gods there in those early verses of Genesis, and that seems to get skipped over quite a lot, doesn't it? Or rather, ignored. There's probably a lot of young Earth creationists who wouldn't even believe you if you said that there was a plural in there.
But of course, that interpretation has much longer history behind it. Like, that interpretation of Elohim as just poetic license is, centuries before Christianity anyway, so it's easier for them to pull in.
Don't want to go past what you said too fast, Matthew, because this conversation isn't only about how young earth creationists see these stories, right? It's not as if these two views are somehow in reasonable competition. You're right to say that the original writers, were maybe telling an allegory here, or, some way of understanding how God did things. And it's not as if that's very controversial. The young earth creationism thing, that has picked up in the U.S. as a bastion for conservative thought since the 1950s especially, right? So we're very committed, conservative evangelicals, fundamentalists are very committed to this six-day literal creation. But it's not as if that interpretation has a lot of support. So you're right to point out that this isn't really a reasonable view, right? It's just how do you have that conversation with a young earth creationist to convince them that these stories were not verbally transmitted? We have that problem, whether we're talking about a virgin birth or tablets coming down from the mountain with Moses, or Ark of the Covenant being that artifact that allowed the children of Israel to defeat enemies in war. You've got these stories about these artifacts and these biblical traditions that is hard to get inside of. It's not as if verbal inspiration is a very credible idea. So
no, and it's interesting.
It's
interesting to say about verbal inspiration, because the other thing that Ken Ham said several times was he referred to God as the author of not just creation, but the account of creation. And no one seemed to pick him up on that. Who was the person who wrote that down first? And was it written down as we read it? Probably not. As I mentioned earlier, it grew from stories and eventually was written down from having been amalgamated from many previous stories. Now, a young earth creationist will clearly scoff at me suggesting that, to go, no. But either God wrote it down physically himself, herself, or a disciple of God's wrote it down having inspiration. And as soon as you introduce a human writing it down, you run into the same problem that Ken Ham was criticizing the old Earth creationists for is people interpreting God and getting something slightly wrong. Well, that's exactly what happened with the first chapter of Genesis. A person wrote it down and got some bits wrong. There's no difference.
Yeah. So I think that's right. Keith, I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to dovetail on that. That's where we get some of these fundamentalist groups that actually realize that the only way to save biblical preservation is, some idea of re-inspiration. So you get that sort of splinter group of KJV only folks that actually believe the English King James Bible was re-inspired by God, because they can see the historical evidence that we all saw, that the texts that have come down to us have obviously not been divinely preserved. And so re-inspiration is really their only avenue that they've found to sort of keep that view in preservation.
Yeah, I think that's right. And this idea of re-inspiration occurs around Christian culture even more recently than the 1601 King James, right? He said, had Joseph Smith in the not terribly distant past, with the Book of Mormon, right? And so there's this sort of ongoing effort to save the Old and New Testament in a variety of ways. Re-inspiration being one, special revelation being another, right? Lots of fundamentalist Christians carry the idea that God does speak to them directly in various ways, either through direct visitation or speaking in tongues, etc. And this is all part and parcel of trying to save the bad ideas, or to promote the good ideas, whatever your particular soapbox is. The Old and New Testament aren't good representations of the way the world works, and we need some method for rescuing those bad ideas. Special revelation is one. Propping up King James through some sort of miraculous means, that's another.
Yeah, and I'd like to go back to what you said earlier about this being mostly an issue since the 1950s, because we do see some of these novel doctrines arising in supposedly extremely traditional groups, because they have to invent these interpretations to support the things like verbal plenary inspiration. And you look at the fundamentals, which are literally the founding documents of the American and British fundamentalist movement out of the fundamentalism modernism controversy. And there is a tract in the fundamentals that declares the fundamentalist position to be old earth creationism.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's really interesting I wouldn't recommend necessarily reading everything in the fundamentals just because they're extremely sort of dry, annoying theological documents. But skim through them and read the interesting ones, because it's really interesting to see where the movement has come from. And along the way, they adopted things like being anti-abortion, being young earth creationist, that were not actually part of this movement that we see now as modern Christian fundamentalism.
So I wonder if you guys would be willing to branch the conversation slightly and talk more specifically about young earth creationism, specifically in regard to some of the claims in Genesis, because we have this idea the earth was created in 6 literal days, and maybe we want to pull that apart a little bit and talk about some of the science and why we think so strongly that this is just not worth consideration by people who are intellectually honest about what the evidence says in regard to the age of the earth.
Absolutely.
Matthew, is that okay with you?
Yeah. No, go for it. I'm just trying to think where to start. It's like...
Okay. I'm going to give you my favorite. This one's so trivial as to almost seem childish, but it's my favorite. He made the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. The moon's not a light.
I have had this conversation on a blog with a creationist, and no word of a lie, it might have been last year, but anyway, in 2010 something, a creationist on a blog said to me straight up, the moon does not reflect the sun's light, it is its own light. And I don't know how you come back to something like that, because when somebody says something like that so confidently, which you think every school child on the planet understands to be false, you've got that kind of moment where you think, this guy's actually not being serious. They're just saying it to wind me up. They are a Poe. This can't be real. But I've had multiple conversations with this guy on this blog, and I don't know how they could hold that as a I'm winding you up attitude without slipping up, and he's not slipped up.
I mean, I
just
hate
don't know
to
how to
step on
comprehend that.
I hate to, Andrew, step on one that you said is your favorite. I don't really see this one as a huge issue, simply because most creationists, the ones I was raised around, the ones I knew in college, the ones I still argue with online, don't really believe that the moon actually creates its own light. Like, you get the people that are just crazy geocentrists, and they believe all the crazy astrophysics like that. But we still, in everyday speech, talk about moonlight. We don't say reflected sunlight. To me, that's not a huge, like, if I were writing a scientifically accurate account of things, I would still use the phrase moonlight, probably, instead of saying solar light reflected by the moon.
But you wouldn't say lesser light. Well, okay. So that's an interesting, okay. This may be
and
worth
don't forget
pulling
also,
apart.
just to jump in here, astronauts on the moon talked about Earthshine as well.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So I guess the question, so Keith, that's a really good point. I say it's one of my favorites. I also acknowledge that it could be considered pretty trivial, right? Mm-hmm. But here's my problem. If you want me to accept, and by the way, we're not talking about how people read this. This was supposed to be God transmitting these things in a verbal plenary way, right? And so that raises the bar for me about the expectation in the writing, especially when it is as easy linguistically to say the greater light to rule the day and its reflection to rule the night.
That's a good point.
Mm-hmm. And
then you've got something that's. Oh, I'm sorry, Matthew.
Yeah, no. You go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and then you've got something that does feel like accuracy. And I agree that linguistically, if we just step back and say greater light to rule the day, lesser light to rule the night, we can still say that we're being, we're using flowery language, but we're still transmitting a fact about history, right? Yeah. I don't have a problem with that. And so it really does depend on how specific you want to think that God was supposed to be.
Yeah.
About, what was supposed to be being transmitted here. To be clear, I don't think there's a God transmitting anything here.
Yeah. But this hypothetical deity should have known.
Right. And this isn't the only place where we find that kind of confusion.
Yeah.
Right. So I agree with you entirely that this may not be the best of all examples, but in a world where I'm expecting a deity to offer some science to back his existence, I would expect this error not to be there, or this type of analogy to be there, when a much clearer communication is as linguistically easy and leads to less confusion.
There are omissions you would expect and omissions you would not, and this is not an omission you would expect.
Right.
Given that hypothesis.
Right. So, I don't know how to reconcile Genesis 1 with anything that we see in the real world. And this bothered me with Ken Ham, this idea that, and this was his appeal in the Bill Nye debate, that somehow our science history is different from our science present, right? That we, the things we observe today may somehow have been different in the distant past. And so maybe you can rescue Genesis that way, right? Maybe the moon was a light. And, so, and now it's 8% albedo yeah. Sorry, yes, we can actually measure the reflectivity of the moon for those people who would like to know. And if the moon's albedo was much higher, we would have a very different ecosystem, right? Because plants need the day-night cycle. And so if the albedo was a lot higher, above 8%, the moon at night would be much brighter, which would have a very serious effect on the ecosystem. But at any rate,
it would. I mean, the life would have evolved to expect a different degree of day-night cycling, rather.
Yeah. So who knows what circadian rhythms would look like in that.
We would see different biology having evolved.
Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe. And that's so. I think it's fair to speculate that if with only that one change, we would still have life. I don't. You have a better background in that kind of thing than I do. My software background doesn't lead me into anything like chemistry, so I'll just accept the idea.
One thing, speaking of these things having to change, a thing that he mentioned and was very quickly glossed over, even by the old Earth creationists who really could have used this as leverage. Ken Ham pointed out inflation, like inflation cosmology, as something that's quote evolutionists, because he likes to call everyone an evolutionist, whether or not they're studying biological evolution or not.
Right. But secular science was another.
Modern cosmologists, he got inflation exactly backwards. Inflation is not a way to get an old universe from what we observe. Inflation is a way to get a universe that is merely 13 or 14 billion years old out of what we observe. Inflation is a way to explain how the universe can be as big as it is and expanding like it is while only being 13 billion years old. And
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And he got that entirely backwards. Like, he should be loving inflation and wanting it to be going faster.
Right, because that saves 6,000 years.
Yeah.
So
do you think...
although... Sorry, Beth, go ahead.
Yeah, so do you think that people from Reasons to Believe, being fellow Christians, don't pull them up on things like that, because that creates unhelpful conflict, and that what they really want is they want to be able to part on a handshake and say, we both love the Lord, and these details are not salvation issues. But as soon as they start attacking him for being scientifically illiterate on saying these ridiculous things, they're creating huge conflict between them, and they're creating a separation in Christianity, and they actually want to part their conversation without a separation.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. And I think an additional reason the old Earth creationist, whose name I forget, didn't call him on that is, this he mentioned several times, still expecting the universe to have a bright line beginning point. And inflation cosmology is one explanation that seems to lead to an eternal universe. And that would give him, not all interpretations of inflation do that, but in calling Ken Ham on his misinterpretation of inflation, he would be inviting criticism of his own universe that had a beginning idea.
Yeah, what we need is a cosmologist on there who is a non-Christian. They're just putting him in his place properly.
And they're not going to interview a secular cosmologist.
Jeff Swearing is the guy opposite of Ken Ham.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
But going back to the moon briefly, the moon was one of the key moments in my exit from young Earth creationism. I discovered podcasts when I got a job when I was working from home. Crumbs, when my daughter was only just born. So yeah, 15 years ago. And so I started hoovering up loads of podcasts and discovered loads of sciencey podcasts and went and found all the Christian Science people and listened to them. And then a couple of secular science podcasts found their way in as well. And I very quickly found Astronomy Cast with Pamela Gay and I can't remember the chap's name. Fabulous podcast. I highly recommend it for anyone who's interested in astronomy. And they were talking about a lot of things in astronomy really clearly and really well, and explaining in quite good detail why we know certain things and why we know that the size of the universe is the way it is, and the Doppler effect on light and all this kind of thing. And I was listening to a couple of young Earth creationist pastors talking about cosmology, and they were talking about the moon, and they were talking about how cosmologists say that the moon is receding away from us a centimetre a year or whatever the distance is. But the moon and the Earth were formed from a giant collision 4.5 billion years ago, and the moon formed from the debris of that orbiting the Earth and then started receding. But if you go and divide the 1 centimetre a year over 4.5 billion years from the distance that it currently is now, you end up with the moon touching the Earth, and that can't happen, because if the moon's touching the Earth, it won't recede. And I was sitting there thinking, no, you're forgetting about the accretion disk. It didn't form touching the Earth; it formed on the accretion disk, and you've completely misunderstood and misrepresented. And while I was still a believer but a faltering YEC at that point, and I just went, no, I just can't deal with this. I've just listened to half an hour of careful, patient, meticulous, sensible explanation, and you guys go and dismiss the entirety of it with a couple of sentences that are full of polemic and contain no authenticated science whatsoever. And it was at that point where I just hit stop, deleted that podcast, and went and killed several other creationist podcasts while I was at it. And I think that was probably the point I got on the top of the slide. I was destined to come out already, I think, and that was just one of those key moments that drew me out. And listening to Ken Ham, it was just like that all over again. Full on the Bible is right polemic and very little else.
Yep.
I think it's that authenticated science bit that Ken Ham was inveighing against. He is maybe the center of the culture of science denying in the United States. He and who is the Ray Comfort? Between Ken Ham and Ray Comfort,
Banana Man.
We hardly stand a chance with these two characters. But so authenticated science is something that we ought to talk about again in regard to DNA. And what that leads us to think about age of the Earth, right? Because as we've cracked the human genome, there doesn't appear to be any way to reconcile what we know of the evolution of the human being against the creation story in Genesis.
Yeah.
At all.
Right.
Yeah. And on the subject of that, one of the things that I found really interesting about one of the things that Ken Ham said in terms of evolution and the millions of years that are required from evolution, it was something else that he got exactly backwards. He made the assertion that the reason why we have to have a really old universe that's billions of years old and an old Earth is it needs to be that old in order for those evil evolutionists to fit in the timescale that's required for their theory of evolution, which undermines the authority of the Bible. The reason why we know the universe is old is because we've got evidence to back it up and to show the age, with the speed of light, as I mentioned earlier, and planetary formation and the expansion and shape of galaxies out there, and the further they're away, the younger these galaxies are, the stars they've got, and the makeup of stars, because stars have got generations in them. In different generation stars are made of different elements, and we can see that. And a star needs to have been alive for millions of years in order to go supernova, and then it needs to be another few millions of years before it goes supernova. And we've got all this data that stacks up to an old universe, and then we've got data in the rocks and all that kind of thing for an old Earth, and that's before we even get to animals and evolution. The millions of years required are already there before we start talking about evolution.
One really interesting.
Go ahead.
No, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, it is not as if people like us sit in our atheist lairs at night and read the Bible and go, what is our most effective way to contradict this? Right? It's not as if we're sitting around going, okay, they said it's 6,000 years. Let's take a vote. 13.8 billion years. That seems about right. Let's use that number for age of the universe. And by the way, we will, we'll bring all of academia in line with this view, right? So we'll somehow get every credible academic to come along. Okay, so I realize that Jeff Zweering would say that he's a credible academic, and I am not attacking his credentials as a cosmologist, and the reason, or as an astrophysicist, or I'm not attacking his education, because he quite clearly said, "Look, dude, there's this thing called light. You might have heard of it, and that thing called light gives us a pretty good indication that the Earth is old." So I don't want to go behind that. But we don't sit in our lairs and thumb our mustaches and just make this stuff up out of whole cloth.
Yeah, and the fact that all of these measures that we have of time interact with each other in such a way that they agree, and people are independently discovering measures that agree with other fields that they don't work in at all.
Yes, right.
I'd like to specifically jump into, since you were talking about DNA, speciation rates. And one of the, I didn't actually think about it this way until after my deconversion, but one of the sort of hilarious ironies of young Earth creationism, at least when paired with a global flood, which most of them do, if the literal Noahic flood.
Genesis 6, 7, and 8 for those of you that want to look up a great fairy tale.
They both deny biological evolution and yet demand an evolution rate orders of magnitude greater than any biologist is even thinking of proposing. For instance, the evolution of modern domestic dogs from wolves, which is dramatically accelerated due to artificial selection, still took about 40,000 years. They want to cram that into about a little less than 5,000 years, because they say all dogs. And if you look at I think it's something like 250,000 years ago, the last common ancestor between coyotes and wolves. And they want to say that happened with their dog kind post-Noahic flood. They're both denying evolution and demanding something happened in 5,000 years that no one claims could happen in anything less than 250,000 years.
Yeah.
Well, and so somewhere in there, I don't know if Pensacola Christian taught this, but the Bible college I went to certainly taught this nonsense. That man is somehow special, and so maybe evolution didn't apply to us in quite the same way. But your breakdown of what happened with dogs and coyotes and wolves, all of that is spot on. And even with our best modern techniques for creating dog breeds and that kind of thing, I doubt very much that we could get that kind of change. Even with today's best efforts, much less the haphazard efforts over the last 40,000 years, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know how to get 6,000 years out of DNA branching without magic.
Exactly. And I just fact checked myself. It wasn't 250,000 years. It was actually 1.5 million, the divergence of wolves and coyotes.
Yeah, you had to have 250,000, man. So give me
yeah,
six
right.
times that.
I was giving them 250,000, and we have another order of magnitude over that they're wrong by.
Yeah, that's it's astronomical. Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry, folks. Terrible pun.
Interesting that they didn't go to evolution in any detail on that discussion, and we know they'd have had trouble talking together if they had.
Oh, yeah. They absolutely have.
Say that again, Keith.
They absolutely would have.
Yeah, and so I was stunned that they didn't talk about the Garden of Eden in any great detail. We've got a friend over at Skeptics and Seekers, David Johnson, that asked me to bring this up just for fun, because if he was here, he'd bring it up. Why the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Why make this thing the center of the garden? Why make the fruit attractive? Why this particular story? And in like sense, why is there such a commitment to it, do you guys think? Because I don't today, as an atheist, understand the deep commitment to reading that story as literal. Keith, I think you were talking about this a little while ago.
Yeah.
We want people to be a little more sensible about the reading of this story.
And
you know what, we're nearly an hour in on this conversation, not quite, and so I need to say this. I need to get this off my chest before you go, Keith. We've been clean up until now, and I'm just going to break that as front warning. That story about the apple and what goes on there, just I read that and I think about that now, and I actually get cross, and I get cross because the God that does that is absolutely a shit-faced bastard of a God. And I'm not interested in that kind of God.
And there went our PG rating.
Sorry, I just need to say that. Go on, Keith. You can go. I'll calm down now. I need 5 minutes.
Let me collect myself. I'm just enjoying shit-faced bastards of a God. That's a wonderful phrase.
That's the English for you.
Okay, yes. The atheists are now going to have new T-shirts. You heard it here first. Don't wear them in the South.
So collecting myself a little here. In my own life, and in my observation of the fundamentalist cult I was raised in, these things are not the starting point. Taking Genesis as literal is not the starting point. It's kind of taking a small set of premises that you absolutely have to nail down, and then accepting every logical sequitur. And to be perfectly honest, the fundamentalists, at least certain branches of them, there are fundamentalists that are very pick and choose, but the branch that I grew up in was probably the most hyper-rational in that particular way. And if you don't have the biblical authority of verbal plenary inspiration, why the Bible? Why not the Bhagavad Gita? Why not the works of Shakespeare? I mean, the works of Shakespeare at least represent an additional 1,600 years of human moral development before they were written. So you have this necessity, if you're going to really truly say, I'm not just going to accept the Bible, but I'm going to justify the Bible as authoritative rationally, then you have to accept everything in it. And Ken Ham is fond of talking about, I forget exactly the phrasing he uses, but he talks about how everything hangs on Genesis. And if you really want to preserve the Bible as authority long term, you have to accept everything in it, and that includes Genesis. And to me, that's where the biggest drive for accepting the Garden of Eden story, or let's say stories, both the Genesis 1 and the Genesis 2 Garden of Eden stories, which we know historically the two cultures those came from. Like, we know historically the origin of those two separate myths, but they have to accept both of them in this form of doublethink to allow themselves to continue believing that the Bible is authoritative. For me, when I became convinced that all of these sequiturs of the Bible's authority were no longer true, I wasn't able to find myself in just sort of progressive Christianville where I thought I would land. I found myself completely unconvinced that the Bible had any authority whatsoever, because that logical syllogism held true in both directions.
So there's just to add on to that, Ham said during the, sorry, I should call him Ken Ham otherwise.
Yeah.
Okay, so Ken, during the debate, talked about the fact that the spiritual heart of the church in the United Kingdom or in Europe was dead, and that the United States was following, and only 18% of youth in the United States attend church. And he said, and I think it's, in his view, it's because we no longer give Genesis this right of persuasion that we used to grant it, right? We don't take the creation account literally, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought, yeah, okay, that sounds good.
Bullshit. It's bullshit. Well, yeah, I'm calling bullshit on that.
Yeah, well, I did too, and here's why. It sounds good, except that I don't think conservative churches that teach Genesis as fact are faring any better in isolation with their young people than the Catholics are with their young people, or the Presbyterians are with their, you pick any denomination that would just accept evolution as taught in a standard public school classroom, right? And so I don't think that teaching Genesis as fact is that thing that's going to save Christianity, even though.
I'm gonna make a prediction here. No, I left Christianity specifically because I was a young Earth creationist, and my increasingly greater understanding of science was causing me such a headache trying to juggle the two. One of them had to give, and I tried to make it science, but I couldn't make that stick. And so I left because of science and because I was a young Earth creationism. It's very, very likely, well, actually I don't know that that's true, it's very, very possible that if I'd been a much more liberal, open-minded, old Earth evolution accepting Christian, that I would still be a Christian. That's a very, very real possibility.
I've told people the same thing about myself.
Yeah, so Keith, I wonder if you had the experience I did. Now, I double majored, and I think I told you I'm 51, so university was a few days ago for me. But I double majored in theology and computer science back in that time. This was back in the late 80s, early 90s, that kind of time frame. And one of the things that drove me off of Christianity, and so I just want to acknowledge that Ken Ham is right in part about this, is I couldn't reconcile my work in a computing classroom and the way I was required to think there against the mental tools that I was asked to use in the theological classroom. So I found that eventually to be extremely off-putting. I can't pray for a compiler to give me good code. Well, okay, wait a minute. That's not true. I can absolutely. But
I was going to say, there are fundamental technical reasons it's necessary to sacrifice a goat at midnight to get C++ to compile.
Okay, so I have often told people that work with me, technical problems do not have solutions, they just have time limits. And it doesn't matter what you're doing at the moment that the clock rolls over to pass the time limit. Whatever you're doing at that time, no matter how crazy it seems, that answer will work. Technical problems do not have solutions, they just have time limits. But we know that's not the case, right? Because once we find an answer, we can use that and reproduce the problem and use the answer again to solve the problem. That's how we know when we've got the right answer, right? When we understand the problem so deeply that we can reproduce the problem and use the same solution. And I couldn't reconcile that depth of understanding in the technical field I chose, and the one that all three of us eventually chose. I couldn't reconcile that depth of understanding with trying to understand the Bible or whatever theological topic was was on the table in the theological classroom.
Yeah, that's exactly my experience as well.
And so I don't know that that's dispositive toward getting rid of, just make everybody learn C++ and all of a sudden we have a better world. I'm not necessarily saying that, primarily because we can do better than C++. Okay, no. Okay, leave it. But I do think that there are, at least for me, the differences in ways to approach the problem of understanding, of whatever we're understanding, was really it was really a very bumpy ride between the two. And I would like to have had a conversation with Jeff Swearing, Jeff from this episode that we're talking about. Sorry, Jeff. I would like to have this conversation with Jeff because clearly he's still a believer, even with a deep technical understanding of science, right? And I get that it just seems to me that there's got to be a point where we leave our science understanding and move to some sort of faith-based understanding. And I don't think he'd disagree with that. But I'd like to know why some people keep that and others don't.
Yeah. I mean, I tried to keep that. Like, I specifically looked into various Christian mystical traditions as some way to keep a spiritual metaphysical identity while remaining intellectually honest with myself. None of it stuck, obviously,
It's
but
hard, isn't it?
Yeah, like, I read...
How long ago did you deconvert?
About 5, maybe 6 years. The Nye-Ham debate was like right near the end of my religion, so that's
that must have been a rough one then. Yeah,
it's interesting because I was already getting to the point of not really being able to keep fighting back with the same apologetic answers I had always given, and that debate, just like, I saw so much of the paucity of those arguments, those standard creationist arguments. As you said, like, there wasn't a whole lot new in this interview we listened to, except for him interacting with another believer, because there are only so many arguments, and seeing them completely laid out there, and seeing Bill Nye completely flustered sometimes by the not even wrongness of how off Ham's ideas were.
Yeah, the one thing that always jumps into my mind when I hear creationists talking about the glory of God's short creation versus what us evil old Earth, old universe people think is, you know what? A God could have created the world 5 minutes ago with everything that it is, with our memories and with the old age, and we wouldn't know the difference. You know, why don't you just take the honest line and go, yeah, it looks old. The science tells us it's old. We can do all these confirming experiments but God just did it that way. Just go down that road. Fighting the science doesn't help.
No, and it gives those footholds for those of us who are trying to actually actively, intellectually reconcile faith with knowledge.
Yeah. Yes,
so,
quite.
I am not even opposed. Okay. Okay. I want to be as intellectually honest here as I can possibly be. And say, I'm not opposed to what Jeff Swearing said toward the end of this episode of Unbelievable. He said, look, if I discovered that the Earth was 10,000 years old, and by the way, young Earth creationists aren't supporting 10,000 years, guys. They're supporting 5 or 6. But I'll give you 10. Fine. Except I don't think you can get 10 out of the genealogies in Genesis and Matthew and Luke. But
No.
never mind all of that. Just giving Jeff his due. He said, "Look, if I suddenly discovered today that I was wrong about the age of the Earth, it wouldn't really change how I do things."
Mm-hmm.
And so he's trying to be honest about the nature of evidence.
Yeah.
And while I am not, I'm not saying that a young Earth would convert me to Christianity. I am open to evidence that says that the Earth is younger than we think it is.
Yeah.
But the trouble is, to say that we get 6,000 years out of this thing, we have to get rid of the very tools of science that the three of us use every day that we don't even think of as science. We just call it reason.
Yeah.
So here's one. Here's just one in a whole basket load. We are currently concerned about human anthropogenic climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And if the science that leads us to believe that anthropogenic climate change is a real problem is a justifiable conclusion, and there are plenty of young Earth creationists who know that we're killing the planet.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If we can't rely on the age of the Earth being what we think it is, that is 4 billion years plus, right?
Yeah.
Then we can't actually rely on the science that says we're killing the Earth.
Nope.
And here's why. The science that we use today, we have every reason to think worked the same way in the past, except Ken Ham doesn't think so.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's the problem. If science is that sketchy, why do we rely on any of its conclusions? Why do I read an EPA sticker out at a car lot and conclude when it says I get 22 miles to the gallon, that's actually what I'm going to get?
Well, let's just say, why is there a car lot? Because, like, the same physics that predict the results of anthropogenic climate change are used to design the internal combustion engines in those cars.
Exactly. And if science was as sketchy an enterprise as Ken Ham thinks that it was in the past, he certainly is living his life with apparently. Now, by the way, for listeners, I don't know Ken, but I do know the ARC project, at least through the news and that sort of thing. He seems to live his life with the same sort of assurances about the objects and physics of the world around him as the three of us do. But somehow he wants us to call those things into question. And I guess what I'm saying in short to the young Earth creationists that might be listening is this. If you think science is the sketchy enterprise that Ken Ham would have you believe that it is, you need to be much more afraid of the world around you than you are. Because nothing that you interact with, from storing your food in the refrigerator and depending on that to keep your food preserved.
Safe.
That's right. To the way your cars behave, to sleep patterns. I mean, there's nothing in your life that you can depend on if you really think Ken Ham is right.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that, and because young Earth creationism isn't just wrong; it's fucking dangerous. You know, because
Amen.
Swallowing young Earth creationism does require you, to question these sciences, and it's a gateway to just rejecting the things that scientists say and know and take for granted. And Andrew mentioned the gases in the refrigerator, the oil that drives your car, and all sorts of so many other things. But it's more than just that. My social media feed does include quite a few young Earth creationists, and the amount of bullshit I see on that, from misinformation about vaccines and them being dangerous to complete denial of climate change, and to really, really horrible comments about that girl Greta, and so many other things which are inaccurate, wrong, dangerous to people's health. Young Earth creationists are disproportionately represented in all the people who are sharing that stuff on social media, and these things cause people to die. So if you're sitting there thinking, oh, it's not a salvation issue, what's the harm? Because it's bloody dangerous.
And
it just lets you deny stuff that saves your life. Stop it.
And if we're going to be going into those negative, let's call them negative externalities of fundamentalist religion, and you said we can be uncensored here, I'm opposed to all religion of all sorts, even moderate religion, because what does moderate religion do? It gives a cover to the fundamentalists.
Yes.
If there weren't religious moderates, everyone would be able to recognize that the fundamentalists were crazy, but now they're just on the end of a spectrum. And I don't know if you guys had this experience, but growing up fundamentalist, you get this persecution complex that all the other Christians in the world are kind of opposed to us. Yep. And then you get out and you realize that, I mean, you look at how the moderate and progressive Christians still defend the Duggar family, for instance. We weren't opposed by mainstream and progressive Christians. We were their monastics. Like, most Catholics don't want to be monastics, but they're glad someone has enough faith to do it. And that's the purpose we served in the intellectual space of the evangelical community.
And that's the big thing that was disappointing to me about this episode of Unbelievable. The reasons to believe guy should have torn Ken a new arsehole, should have come out with this kind of attack, should have painted him into a corner, because that's where he belongs. Yeah. Because he is a scourge on our intellect, on our society, and that needs to be called out. And Christians, if you're sitting there being nice to your young Earth creationist brethren because they're saved just like you, call them out. We need to see Christians pointing out nonsense, because you, the nice Christian, the middle of the road Christian, the liberal Christian, the gay affirming Christian, by not calling out the people who have got these utterly distasteful attitudes in our society, you are being tainted by that. Don't. Let them burn.
I'll simply say that if you are that person, but you don't call out Ken Ham, you are one step away. This is gonna sound like atheist hate speech, but I'm all in on it.
Embrace it.
I am all in on it. If you are the kind of person who can sit by and watch your church donate to something like the Art Project, or you buy Ken Ham's books, or you're not actively opposing this nonsense that is part and parcel of science denying, you are only one step removed from the very same Catholics that didn't report priests that abused children.
Yeah. Yeah. That's how
I told you that sound like atheist hate speech. So there it is.
That's how we see you guys. You need to own it. Changing tack very slightly, honest question to you two, especially Keith. I'm interested to hear your answer, because it was only 5 years for you. It's crumbs between 10 and 15 years for me. I've given up counting. I spent a lot of time feeling not just embarrassed but ashamed that I'd spent so many years as a young Earth creationist. Have you gone through that period? Are you still sometimes having that twang?
I have. I'm kind of at the stage where I'm just angry at the years stolen from me.
Yeah. I get that.
I recognize now that, especially, just like I've learned enough about cognitive science and such, like being raised in that environment, I had no chance to get out really any sooner than I did. The only time period I'm really actually upset at myself about in the dark times is the time period between leaving undergrad and actually deconverting. Those 8 or 9 years, no one was actively making me stay in the cult, and I was still there. I recognize that is the result of long indoctrination, but there are still times it feels like I should have chosen to leave earlier.
Yeah, I get that, and I struggled with that as well. I did have an angry period. I don't know how long it lasted. Some of my atheist friends did point out to me that I just seemed like I was angry against religion, and then some defended me and said, "Well, he's justified. Come on, look what it's stolen from him."
Yeah.
So I did have that, but I mostly remember shame and embarrassment, and I'm over that now. And now I just embrace my past, and I bitch about religion indoctrination and young Earth creationism very, very enthusiastically.
Yeah. I actually just I posted a picture in the Facebook group when you were asking for people to join this episode.
Your tattoo, that's awesome.
Yeah. I just got that 2 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago now, so it's just finishing healing up. It's been long in coming, but it's kind of a reminder that of where I came from, and that I explicitly and intentionally created the self I am now. Because one of the big evidences for me that made it impossible to keep believing young Earth creationism was the genetic evidence for the evolution of mitochondria. Like, they're independent organisms. There are symbiotes. They're obligate symbiotes by now, and they're in every eukaryotic organism. And they have a family tree that now, because they've been living with other organisms for so long, exactly overlays the family tree of the organisms that are their hosts. And we can extend that family tree out and see the modern bacteria that are part of their family tree. They are related to Rocky Mountain spotted fever and other intracellular parasitic bacteria. And having this there, like, I was just at an event where a whole lot of people at this festival had not seen me in quite some time. And I got a lot of questions about it because it was a dance event. I dance a lot. And this is the arm that is in front of my partner's face whenever they turn around. And so a lot of people were seeing it and asking me about it. And if I don't want to go into the details, I can just tell them I was a biologist before I was a software engineer and leave it at that. But people are so supportive when I tell them I was raised in a young Earth creationist religious cult, and the biological evidence, the genetic evidence for the evolution of mitochondria was a huge part of my escape. And no one is like, "Oh my God, I can't believe you were a creationist. I have no respect for you." They're all, "Wow, I can't believe you went through that. I'm so glad you got out."
Yeah.
So,
can
in
I
a way,
ask
that history literally on my sleeve.
Brilliant.
I love
think that's
it.
awesome.
Can I ask? So, the listeners will remember that from time to time, I acknowledged that I was in a cult. I wasn't just a Christian. I was a crazy radical, and I would even say hateful Christian from where I stand now. So I was a member of the Church of Christ, and if it's not revealing too much, can you share what denomination you grew up in?
Yeah. So I grew up in the IFB, or Independent Fundamental Baptist movement.
I know them.
I was going to say, I know you probably do. Matthew, are you familiar with IFBs?
I'm familiar with the name, but I might know them as something slightly different.
Okay. So Ken Ham is, and that style of Baptist that he is the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement. The easiest way to explain them is they are one of the last remaining cults from the conservative side of the Jesus movement in the 70s. They were founded by people like Jerry Falwell and Francis Schaeffer. So the
I know
IFB
that
movement,
name.
yeah.
Why do I know that name, Francis Schaeffer?
Francis Schaeffer is extremely popular even in progressive theological circles today. He was one of the people that lent a lot of intellectual authority to the fundamentalist movement in the 70s and 80s. And he ran a commune in Switzerland called L'Abri, and it was notorious for being extremely open-minded about who they allowed there. You know, Buddhist hippies and everyone would go, and he and his family would just kind of hold court over deep philosophical discussions through a very conservative lens. Honestly, I don't think, and this is one thing that I've voiced to some other people in the last year or so, I've been thinking about this. I don't think we would be facing as large a fundamentalist movement right now if it weren't for Francis Schaeffer, because he was one of those links that make the fundamentalists look like part of a continuum instead of the outliers. And he was right there on that fringe with this intellectual facade supporting the fundamentalist craziness.
Right.
His son Frank Schaeffer very famously left the fundamentalist movement and joined the Eastern Orthodox Church. And you may hear him commentate on things in the mainstream media on occasion.
Right. Cool. I'd like to comment on my upbringing on the subject of young Earth creationism, and going back to my rant of 10 minutes ago about how it's not just wrong but dangerous. If you are a missionary supporter, you supported people like me growing up. I grew up in the missionary culture of environment in Zambia. I've mentioned it on one or two other podcasts before. More of my story available on the Graceful Atheist podcast if you want to rewind a couple of episodes on that podcast, as well as Andrew's. So I grew up in Zambia. My first awareness really is of growing up in Zambia, missionary environment on a farm outside Lusaka, the capital of Zambia, and went to a school that was specifically for the missionary children there. So overtly Christian environment with Christian teachers, some from America, but not all, some from the UK as well. And it was all young Earth creationist teaching. You know, one of the memories I have is getting a new science book in the class and us being told to turn to a particular page which described evolution as fish crawling across land to ponds, and eventually these fish over many generations develop legs, and we were all told to scratch that out because evolution is wrong. You know, God created every animal as it is. But you know, myself and my brothers and all the friends that we had, you know, we were also children of missionaries, were all indoctrinated into this. So if you have any discomfort over the teaching of young Earth creation to people, then think about the missionaries that you are supporting, because what are their children, people like me, being educated in and being brought up? It's often, very often, young Earth creationism. And what you're doing is, when you're supporting and funding missionaries abroad and their children are being raised like that, is you are creating 40 years down the line bastards like me. Think about it.
So I'll tell a little part of this story. Keith, I've got a newborn, so it's funny for a 50-year-old guy, 51, to be rearing children again. but I am. I've got a daughter. She's 2.5 months old now, and my close family here in Georgia are conservative evangelicals, Church of God and Assembly of God, and there are at least 4 ministers in the family that preach in the Church of God or Assembly of God. So one of the things that we naturally do when the family gets together, or at least they naturally do, is they hold hands and pray over every meal. And so, to Matthew's point about thinking about what you're doing to kids, I don't allow that with my daughter. We now no longer. I mean, I did before she came along, because I can't be indoctrinated. I'm too old to be brainwashed. But she's not, and so I've said no to prayer with her involved, because I simply won't have her learn forgive us of our sins. It's just simply not a message that is going to be communicated to her on a regular basis. We're not broken creatures. And each of us has acknowledged in some way during the course of this conversation that part of what fundamentalist Christianity does is teach you that you're broken somehow, that you're not a whole person, that somehow there was a fall of man. That's what Ken Ham talked about a little bit. Another one of the things he talked about a little bit in this Unbelievable episode is, this whole sin thing and groaning of creation and all of that sort of thing, that we're somehow in need of substitutionary atonement and the blood of Jesus. And I will just simply say, if you're listening, you're not broken. You don't need blood magic to redeem you. Now, it may be that you have some particular situation that needs to be addressed in your life, but we all do. And we're not broken because we're human. And we can rely on each other better when we acknowledge each other's humanity than when we attempt to find some deity. So, to Matthew's point, I will simply say again, amen. Think about ask yourself, what happens to your child 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the line? You hear 3 stories right here that say those problems, the problems of religious baggage, become so deeply intractable that we have to find a way out. Don't do that to your kids. No. You're not broken, and neither are they. Okay, sorry, I'm off my soapbox.
I know it's not strictly young earth creationism. This is Christianity in general, but I do really, really struggle with the doctrine of you are broken, you are evil, you are sinful, you deserve torture and torment and death, or whatever version of hell you believe in. And only Jesus can say. And I've seen people struggle with depression in church, and I really genuinely think that doctrine of wicked humanity doesn't sit well with people who have got health problems to do with depression. I just don't think those are a match that work well.
Well, they did talk about it in this show. Both Ken and Jeff talked about needing the love of Jesus, yada, yada, yada. I can only say in as honest a way as I know how, and then, atheists that claim to be honest about these kinds of things, sometimes we're accused of never having Christians or all sorts of ad hominem attacks, right? I can only say that I am a better human being today, living life honestly and recognizing that, we're all alike, and we're all traveling this road, and we're not being divided by a God who is separating the wheat from the chaff, the good from the evil, or the goats from the sheep, or whatever New Testament parallel you prefer, right? We travel this road better. And I am a better human being when I don't think that some God prefers me to a child who's starving in Ethiopia.
Yeah. I'm going to rewind back to the Garden of Eden, because you asked Andrew about, or one of you asked about what part of the Garden of Eden story, and I ranted about the apple. I'd like to go back to the apple story. We have a dog. We have a dog here at home, and sometimes the dog stays with the grandparents, my wife's parents, because we go away or something. And a couple of years ago, one of the first times that the dog stayed with them for the weekend, mother-in-law made a pastry-based dessert. Exactly what it was, it doesn't really matter, and put it on the low table in the conservatory to cool. Went away for a couple of hours in the afternoon, came back, the dog had eaten half of it, had vomited over their floor, was really ill and unwell. It was quite a lot of effort to clean it up, and they didn't get the pie that they'd made. Did we beat the dog? Did we whip the dog? Because it was there. The dog should have known it wasn't for it to eat. No, we say, we kind of said to the dog, well, your fault for being sick because you ate the pie, but Grandparents, you shouldn't have left it in reach.
Mm.
It's their fault. It was their mistake. So the Garden of Eden story, it doesn't make sense at all to punish Adam and Eve and their descendants for the apple.
Nope.
If you don't want them to eat the apple, don't put it within reach. It's really that simple.
It is. I was telling David Johnson over at Skeptics and Seekers today on the phone. I said, there's a problem with this shiny fruit in the story. Oh, okay, it's not like there's one.
It wasn't really an apple. We call it an apple in modern days, but
right. And I'm happy to go with that. But there's a problem.
It was probably a mango.
Yeah. So here's one of the issues that causes me to just shake my head in bewilderment about the story. So the idea is that Eve and then Adam had this knowledge of good and evil after consuming this fruit. Now, there's a reason that doesn't make sense to me. And that is that Eve had already decided prior to consuming this apple, if you will, that what God wanted for her was wrong. And so it seems to me that implicitly there must have been some knowledge of what she wanted for her life. I don't care whether you call it good or evil. Good and evil. There was a knowledge of another path, and she'd already decided against God prior to eating the fruit.
Yeah.
So the story is allegory is fine. The story is rational. The story is rational element of history. I don't buy it.
Yeah. And again, you read the story, and even having been translated multiple times through multiple languages before arriving at English, reading the story, it reads like an ancient culture trying to make sense of a world that they understood only a fraction to the ability that we do today. That's fine. I don't consider them stupid, ignorant, evil, whatever, for writing down that mythology to explain something that they had no other way of explaining. There are many cultures with many different stories about beginnings and all that, because we're all curious about that. Anyone who thinks for more than 5 minutes is going to go, I wonder where it all goes back to if you rewind it. It's an obvious question for a curious mind to come up with, and lots of minds came up with lots of things, and just happens that this particular myth has survived better than others. But to believe it now as literal, as true, that there is no excuse, really. Nope. There isn't.
There really isn't.
So imagine, Eve decides against God already, right? What is the knowledge that the fruit conveys after she consumes it that she didn't have at the moment that she said, I think God is wrong and I'll be fine?
Yeah.
You know what? If I could just understand everything there was to know, or just by eating a fruit, oh my word, I would be so rich. I would cut it up in pieces and sell it,
And
a knowledge smoothie.
Yes.
And how I tend to interpret that knowledge that she gained was, like, as humans, we do have the sort of these emotional feelings that feel very much like knowledge of right and wrong. We have something that we have some set of cognitive processes we tend to interpret as conscience. Yep. Until very recently, we had, until 30 years ago, we had no clue why those were there, where they came from. We're only beginning to understand those cognitive processes. Yeah. And since they had, it's very obvious where observational knowledge comes from. And at least in a culture that believes in revelation, it's very obvious where revelatory knowledge comes from. But innate knowledge, this sort of epistemic class of things somehow you just know, that we now are starting to explain as this combination of neurological empathic drives and acculturation from, early childhood just seems innate. It's an epistemic class they had no explanation for. And so it becoming something akin to revelatory was, well, because they already accepted revelatory knowledge as a class of knowledge, that makes a lot of sense to me. And so it's really easy for me to say, well, in absence of any other evidence of what the ancients believed this knowledge was, when it says knowledge of good and evil, I tend to, by default, interpret that as them explaining the origin of conscience, of intrinsic ethical knowledge.
So there's a lot interesting in there. First, for the listeners, look up bicameral mind.
I was about to go there. Julian James, one of my favorite writers.
Okay, so look up Julian James bicameral mind at Google. It is challenging reading. So don't start it when you're babysitting the kids. You need to pay a little more attention to that. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that I think we're going to learn. Okay, so this is Andrew with his hat on as prognosticator of science future, right? So, I can't claim to have any prophetic power here, but we do know that there are kinds of things that we learn before we have memory of learning. So one of those things is object permanence, right? Babies. Very young babies don't have an idea of object permanence. When those things aren't in their field of view, they don't exist. Later on, we learn object permanence, but I'm willing to bet that none of the three of us remember the moment when we said, aha, when I look away, that thing is still there. We don't remember gaining a sense of object permanence, but we did learn it at some point. And so I think we will discover that at least some of that class, the epistemic knowledge that you were talking about, I think we'll discover over time that what we think knowledge is some fundamental building blocks that we learn prior to memory. And one of the reasons that I think that is probably the case is because of the range of human behavior. Children that are raised in very different homes grow up with different sets of sort of epistemic beliefs. And we can sort of talk sensibly in broad categories about what that looks like. I don't know that we will ever nail down every kind of epistemic claim that we might make to some sort of early knowledge. Did you always know that 1 + 1 = 2? Well, I think that's so I don't know, but I think that at least some of that category you were talking about goes back to very early learning. Maybe not all of it. All of it.
And a lot of that tends to, I think we're starting to learn, tends to be neuroplastic effects. It's not just intellectual conscious knowledge. It's literally changing how we respond to things. You see some of the research coming out about observed correlations, and of course the direction of causation isn't known, between political beliefs and amygdala responses and disgust responses, and how those neurological pathways that of course exist as independent neurological structures for doing things like controlling social interactions for group cohesion and controlling food acquisition and avoiding sickness. And those get repurposed in our complex conscious minds and trained in certain ways. So this learning doesn't even have to be knowledge. A lot of times what we see as knowledge feels to me like conscious attributions applied retroactively to these unconscious processes that we observe metacognitively.
Yeah. There was an interesting, if I can find it, I'll link it in the show notes. There was an NPR podcast in the last couple of days on this very topic. If I can find it, I'll link it. I tend to agree that in areas like decision making, we think of ourselves as being very rational, but the thing that we think of as rational decision making usually isn't. There's a lot of research about this kind of thing.
And I don't know that I heard the episode you're talking about, but was this talking about some of the research showing that the mechanism of decision making is not initiation of action, but suppression of reflex, of suppression of automatic action?
Oh no, I didn't hear that. I didn't hear that episode. But do you remember which NPR property aired that episode?
Oh, I don't remember that. I read a paper about it, and I was assuming that it might have gotten through to something like what you're talking about.
Well, and it may have. I didn't get the whole interview. It was in the car, and the car got somewhere, before it was over. So, but I get the sense that we're winding to a close, and I don't want to make the listeners listen through a lot more of my rambling off topic about creation. So, Matthew,
I've got something I want to bring up before you get 2 foot into lifting your foot off the gas, and it's back to evolution. And this is again was just an awesome experience for myself. I'd already deconverted, but and I was still unpacking in my mind the consequences of having made that decision, and I was still writing the blog about my deconversion, and I found myself doing a job working for the Natural History Museum in London. So I spent I can't remember, a couple of months commuting regularly and staying in London for the week and spending the day working behind the scenes on the computer system at the Natural History Museum in London. And that was just fabulous because every day I got to walk past all these things, and I had a pass which allowed me to go and see various places. And while I was working there, an exhibition was put on called the Animals Inside Out exhibition. I don't know if you two have heard of it. We're going back a few years, going back about 10 years or so. But if you Google it, that you will see some glorious photos. But basically what it is a German chap did it. I'm just looking for his name and I can't see it on the screen in front of me. But it's called Animals Inside Out. I think Body Worlds is another name. But Google. And basically the process that this guy did was he got many different animals, and he injected formaldehyde or some kind of rubbery thing through all the blood vessels in the animal so that it solidified, and then took away the body of the animal with acid. So what was left was the structure of the body represented with the blood vessels of the body. So these animals, the images are utterly glorious, just so fascinating. But you've got the animals skinless, you see the bones, you can see the gaps in the bones, you can see where all the muscles are, and blood vessels, as I said. And then they're dressed, so some of them you've got fur and skin put back on after the effect, so you can just see a little bit more of it. And it was absolutely an epiphany walking through this exhibition and looking at. And it was the mammals that really did it for me, and the body plans of the mammals and where the body organs were and what the organs were and the relationship between organs, and then the bones and the muscle structure on the bones and the joints, and go and look at the biggest animals like the elephant, and then going back to the small ones, the shrew and the mouse, and then looking at, and they're the same. The basic body plan is the same across them all, and it's not until you see them stripped away like that you really get it. And these aren't mock-ups of fossils. These are real animals that have really lived, and you can see them exactly as they are. And I was just lost, and it was just utterly glorious looking through this. And I came away thinking, how could anyone look at this? And then you've already mentioned DNA and genetics, Keith, but when you've got that added to this, and the knowledge that we already have from breeding dogs and pigeons and other animals, how can you not get that together and then still deny evolution. And it was, and look, I'm looking at the page of some photos from this exhibition in front of me, and I just can't take my eyes off them. They're utterly beautiful, utterly mesmerizing, and I'm lost for what else to say. And that was just a fabulous experience to me to go there, and the realization to me that yes, I was right to leave it. This is the evidence in front of me. Hallelujah! I'm free.
I love that, I love that you kind of took us to this point, which I was hoping we would get to. Of it's one thing, like we obviously need to keep fighting against how these bad ideas negatively affect our society, but I like being able to visit the beautiful of it as well.
Yes.
And looking at life and seeing how it evolved makes it just so inconceivably more beautiful to me.
Yes.
A way I've been thinking about it so much recently, if you look at sort of the ideas for prebiotic evolution, chemical evolution, and the ways that life as we know it, cellular life, possibly originated in protocells and chemical hypercycles, all of these things. It's part of the geochemistry of a seismically active, rocky, mostly silica and iron planet. It's just what happens. And if you look at life and see like the body worlds, the animals inside out, and see all of these different ways it unfolded, and you keep going back, all of life I've started seeing as just these long fringy outgrowths of this one long complicated chemical reaction that just keeps going on. And we're part of that. We're over on the fringes here. But if you see some of those chemical reactions where they put like a drop of something in a solution and then it causes these concentric circles or fractal patterns of different colors of compounds to be produced, that to me is a really beautiful picture of how life on this planet, and if it has arisen elsewhere, which it probably has, how it will look other places. All of life being this completely unique, large chemical reaction in all of these beautiful fringes and different directions that it has gone.
I find
that's actually interesting.
So yeah, I find nature so much more beautiful now that I'm out, and I never would have predicted it. It was a surprise to me when I found myself looking out across a beautiful landscape and just going, "Wow!" I'm sitting here looking at this, enjoying this, and it really was, and believing that a god just magicked it all into a place robbed so much character, so much beauty, so much awness from the natural world. And now that is no longer a feature of my thinking, I appreciate it so much more. It's just glorious.
There is a reason that we are chemically the way we are, and not some other chemical element on the periodic table. Carbon as an element, without getting into a lot of chemistry, really easily freely associates with other elements, and it freely associates in a way that even one of its closest cousins, silicon, doesn't freely associate. And so it struck me, Keith, when you were talking a minute ago about these sort of fringes and things. When we look at long carbon chains, we see a sort of free association, carbon being one of those biological elements, right? And so we can look at the nature of carbon and understand why we get the sort of complex chemical nature in living organisms, and why we don't get it out of something like a heavy metal or hydrogen, or So there are this thing that we think of as life. We're peeling back the layers of the onion every day, right? And discovering that life probably is as amazing as we think that it is, but it's not as surprising as we think that it is.
No, it's not. It's inevitable. Really?
You look at the history of the Earth, and as far as we can tell, life arose as early as it possibly could. Like as soon as the Earth was cool enough for there to be liquid water and the seismic activity bringing the kinds of elements that carbon needs to associate with to create this wonderfully complex chemistry, it arose. And possibly, though there's no evidence for it, this could be the second phase of life on Earth, because before Theia, the hypothetical planetoid, that the collision of which products became the Earth we have now and the Moon, the Earth was probably cool enough with liquid water and seismically active, though obviously that was a huge event that obliterated most of the geological history of the Earth before that. That life probably existed in some sense before, was massively, had a massive extinction event, and completely re-arose from scratch at the end of the Hadean.
That would be a bad day if you were conscious when that happened, wouldn't it? That would be properly shit.
And looking at the history of the universe, it's probable that the Earth is in one of the first populations of planets that life became possible as well. So we could have arisen just as soon as possible, and the reason we haven't seen other life is just we happened early, and other planets are still forming that are going to be the next bubbles of life.
And
I think there's a word for that. I'm just going to try and find it.
The universe is very, very big. And so I tried to pass this along to some friends a year or two ago. If you think that it's possible that some civilizations,
Fermi paradox, that's what it is.
Yeah. And this is my answer. My personal answer to the Fermi paradox is that we're early.
We may be. And the thing is, let's say you think of a civilization like ours that might end up encountering a great filtering event, nuclear war, destruction of our globe, running out of resources because we mismanaged. I mean, there are all sorts of great filter events that might get rid of us, and so maybe there's a civilization that arose, and they're around for a couple thousand years, maybe 10,000 years, but how rare would it be if we're even a little rare, right? How rare would it be, given the size of the universe, for any two civilizations that last for a few thousand years with the ability to look for other life? How rare would it be for them to not just pass without ever noticing each other?
Yeah, and an example I've used for people is a kettle of water. As it starts boiling, as the conditions become right for these bubbles to start forming, they're first forming very far apart from each other. The odds of two of them hitting each other, these sort of spheres of influence, are very low. As the conditions become more and more favorable to it, now suddenly you have a rolling boil and the bubbles are hitting each other all the time. With an estimated habitable lifetime of our universe of about 100 billion years, and the time since the observable event we call the Big Bang has been 13 to 14 billion years, if these physical ideas are correct, we are just past the first 10% of the universe's lifetime. We could be one of those bubbles of life and sort of life influence that is never going to hit another bubble. Even if
we could say we will sail out of the Goldilocks zone into the super hot regions. Well, it doesn't even have to be super hot, just not freezing on the planet anymore. Before we find that we have relatives out there somewhere.
What if the sweet spot in sort of the history of the unfolding of a universe, the sweet spot for lots of planets near each other forming life might be, 30 billion years? Then we are very early outliers, and there just need to be a bunch more supernovas creating a bunch more heavy elements before life can be ubiquitous.
Right. And our sun won't last that long. Another 30 billion. It won't come close. And, whether, without some civilization level attempt to get us out of here, some very science fiction future, we just won't ever know that the universe was actually teeming with life.
Yep, exactly. Because the teeming with life right now, like, given a probable infinite universe, there are probably civilizations out there that are just outside of our sort of causal horizon. We're never going to see evidence of them.
They could simply be over the visible horizon, which is 13.8 billion years, and we'll never know they're there. But I'm a proponent of the idea that the visible horizon is not sort of the edge of the universe as we think of it, the expanding edge of the universe. And the further away an object is from us, the faster it is moving away from us. Mm-hmm. And so those things, so I don't have any reason to think that sort of 13.8 billion light year distance is actually the end of the universe, just the end of our visible part of it. And the things that are beyond that 13.8 billion year edge, if you will, are simply those things that are moving away from us faster than the speed of light.
Yep.
So we'll just never see them, but there's no reason to think that there might not be habitation there too, and we just won't ever know. Now, I don't have a great reason to think there is either, but I don't find it implausible given what I understand of the universe.
Yeah, and given that life seems to be inevitable when you have carbon-nitrogen chemistry on a rocky planet.
Right.
And if I can throw...
No, you carry on. You carry on. I'll just throw in something afterwards.
Yeah, if I can throw one more book recommendation out for the listeners, a fictional book actually. Neil Stephenson has a book called Anathema that
it's fantastic.
Yeah, explores the ideas of causal connection and disconnection really, really interestingly. It's science fiction, so it's not like an example of exactly how our universe works. But it gives a lot of really concrete ways to think about things like the causal horizon or visible light horizon of our visible universe. Highly recommend Anathema. Huge tome. It'll take you forever to read if you read like me, always forgetting the book and moving on to something else. But highly recommend, and it gives a lot of really great sort of ways to think about causality.
And read his other work too, because he's just he rocks as an author.
And this is another example of why science trumps belief. We've been talking for however long it is about the size of the universe and speculating on life and how life arises and all that. And we know all this through the diligent work of scientists. Young Earth creationists like I was and like Ken Ham will confidently say there is no other life out there. We're special on this planet, and they'll just say it because that is what their belief mandates that they need to say. And any diligent effort by scientists to explain various things just gets completely overridden and ignored.
Now you're going to get me on my soapbox about the predictive nature of science and the fact that young Earth creationists have not managed to come up with a model that predicts anything, that predicts a single damn thing.
Yeah, they're continually having to revise their model. If you're familiar with the ICR's quote rate project, which is the radioisotopes and the age of the Earth, where they basically try just destroying in their own minds the various radiometric dating methods.
That is the entirety of their science. You go and read their pages, and all they're doing is finding. I was going to say they're cherry picking science articles that they've got somebody that can comment on, and then they go and jiggle about the science that's said in it, pick relevant bits or bits that they wish to highlight from the science article, and then put their creationist spin on it. They're not actually doing science. When creationists go and do that on the ICAR website or whatever, go and find the original article, read that, understand what the scientists are saying and why they're saying it. You'll get far greater education and value out of it, and you'll see why creationism is bunkum.
Yeah. And all the while, as they create these greater and greater complexity level of responses to newer and newer science, their own model, the creationist model, if you try approaching it through the ICR, creation science model, just gets ridiculously complicated. They have to propose things like unreasonably fast rates of genetic evolution with some weirdly specific block between kinds. They have to propose variable speed of light. They have to propose all of these mechanisms that just make their model one of the most complex models ever proposed for how the universe could possibly work.
Yeah.
And a model that is entirely devoid of testability.
Yep.
And it's this is why you both said earlier, and I agreed. This sort of teaching is not only wrong; it's dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
It is.
Keith, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Still Unbelievable. Will you consent to come back and kick some,
absolutely
kick some other things around with us?
This has been a great chat. I just took a gamble on my plea earlier today for somebody to join us because I thought I'm going to be winging it. Yeah, I'm going to be doing it off the cuff. Somebody else on the Make It 3 Voices will be far more interesting, more fun for me, and I hope I'll get confirmed that it's going to be more interesting for the listeners as well. So thank you, Keith. I'm really pleased that you've come on.
No. And I was thrilled. It was perfect timing because I had just gotten off my morning meeting when I saw that and found out that I don't have any meetings the rest of the day because they've all been canceled. So it was a perfect day for me.
The Lord works in mysterious ways.
I was going to say, once again, God propping up the atheists.
We've been touched by his noodly appendage.
Okay. And I thought we'd lost our PG rating earlier.
Hey, I don't know where you went with that, but I'm talking about spaghetti monster.
I think my colander is in the dishwasher.
I think my mind is in the gutter.
Oh dear. Right. Okay. So any final thoughts, guys? Unless anyone's got anything else to put onto. I mean, we could probably do another 2 hours on it, but it's probably time to wind down. Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just going to continue as an atheist bitching session about. No, I'm clear, guys.
I guess my final thought would be for people like us that have left religion and left a major part of our identity behind. It's really healthy to look for the beautiful things that are now open to us, not just at the things that we have to fight, even as we keep fighting.
I agree, and Andrew and I have been having that conversation offline over different matters recently. Being atheists like we are does not mean that we're looking at the world down our noses because we're superior and everything is beneath us. Life is awesome. Life is wonderful. Life is beautiful. And yes, to the atheists out there who engage with religion like we do, not everything is dark and dim. Let's embrace the glories of the natural world.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Matthew, if you don't mind, I'll give the contact.
Yes, you do that, Andrew.
All right. So if you're listening, thank you for joining us for this episode of Still Unbelievable. Thank you to Keith again, and I really do want you to come back. If you'd like to get in touch with us, by all means, get in touch. You can get in touch with us at reasonpress@gmail.com or in the show links. There will be a link that you can touch and send us a voice message. We look forward to hearing from you, and you've probably heard through the grapevine, and it is true that we take questions and comments even from Windows and Android users. So Thank you for listening to this episode of Still Unbelievable.
Oh, we've missed a lot of tricks on Apple versus PC this episode, haven't we? We've just got so enthusiastic in the YEC bashing that we've forgot our primary mission, haven't we?
Yeah, well, not even Windows users are YECs. I'm sorry. No, this is Andrew signing off from my sleep deprivation lair deep in the heart of Georgia.
And Matthew from Siders in Somerset. Cheerio.
And this is Keith, also in Georgia. Have a good day.
Thank you, guys. That was brilliant. I had such a good time. Oh, I'm so glad I caught that.
I did too.